today we're going to talk about an under-examined sector in labor studies, which is the academic sector. It is under-examined due to a variety of reasons, of which I think the reluctance of academics to see themselves as workers actually ranks the highest. We are going to talk about this more in detail during this session. And we're going to discuss the current dynamics of academic work and employment. We're going to see that those dynamics involve and reproduce a number of problems and mechanisms of exploitation that are actually common to all creative and intellectual sectors. Here I have a little agenda for today to give you an idea. We're going to start with the transformation of academic labor relations from the last quarter of the 20th century onwards. That will give us a historical background and help us locate the problem in the socioeconomic history of our world system, so to speak. And I'm going to briefly summarize how temporary and flexible forms of employment became the norm and what types of precarious labor prevail in academia today. Then we are going to take a look at what contingent academic employment practices mean in terms of the quality of higher education, what they mean for the career trajectories and individual lives of researchers, including their mental and physical health. And last but not least, we are going to talk about how the contingent employment practices affect peer relations in academia. Then we will talk about the sector-specific dynamics and some traditional features of the academic work culture that play a favorable role in the neoliberal restructuration of academic work. And as a last point, we're going to take a brief look at how the non-tenured majority responds to the working conditions that are imposed upon them. More specifically, I'm going to mention, the current forms of academic labor activism among early career researchers, but this is going to be a brief part of the overall session. And I have to say right away, I have a problem with the term early career as well, because most of these people, most of the so-called early career academics have been in the business for over a decade, and they have years of teaching and research experience, but they are being infantilized as early career just because they don't have tenure, which is a huge part of the problem, I think. And we're going to talk about that later as well. By the way, just to show you briefly, you see a little list at the bottom of the slide. You are going to see similar lists at the bottom of several slides. These are little literature lists to, give you a little more in-depth insight if you're interested in the topics. So you might want to keep an eye on them as well. So let's start with the historical background of the problem. Over the course of the past 2-3 decades, the parameters of academic work and employment have changed drastically. And this transformation should, of course, be understood within the overall socio-historical restructuration that we call the neoliberal turn. I'm not going to delve into what neoliberalism is now, because I think you talk about this in this course anyway. But just to, briefly remind you, when we say neoliberalism, what we mean is basically a political project that aimed at simultaneously refurbishing the profit rates that were declining towards the end of the 1970s and curbing the political power of the working class. And this political project tried to do this by re-regulating the labor markets explicitly according to the interests of the capital. And it basically involved the draining of funding in public sectors. It involved a cutback of existing workers' rights. It involved an increase in unemployment and debt. It involved the replacement of steady employment with more flexible and temporary practices. And last but not least, it involved a systematic reduction of real wages starting with the early 1980s. And this happened more or less simultaneously across the entire globe through different means, of course. In the peripheral countries, it followed more overt political oppression mechanisms such as coup d'etats, etc. In the core countries, it tried to create consent, but at the end of the day, the aim was the same everywhere. And naturally, all of these things that I just mentioned, you know, the rollback of existing workers' rights, the cutback in public funding, or the transition to more temporary forms of employment, etc. All these things also happened in the academic sector. You know, the academic sector, we like to think that our profession is like exempt from what happens in the rest of the world, but it's not. All these things also affected the academic sector. Now, what was interesting was that the academic sector had historically been associated with secure and long-term employment, albeit low paid, but at least high security. And it was typically in the form of tenured professorship, which was accompanied by a civil servant status. And that was when there was proper public funding, of course, in higher education. But over the course of the last few decades, this has changed, and it changed rapidly and drastically, especially in the last 2 decades. And public funding decreased also in higher education. So what happened when public funding decreased? Logically, naturally, the universities became more and more dependent on external funding, or third-party funding, as we generally call it. And this thing that we call third-party funding may either involve direct external research funding from private enterprises and foundations, or it can involve additional state subsidies, which is the case, for example, with the Excellence Initiative in Germany. But even if it comes in the form of additional state subsidies, it is based on a university's track record of successful third-party funding acquisition from private enterprises. So even to get state funding, I mean, additional state funding, you have to prove that you're actually capable of getting private money, like corporate money, which works like a vicious cycle for the universities, especially in countries like Germany, where the universities are still basically public, where they cannot rely on student fees as the universities in the UK or the US, for example. The universities find themselves in a situation where they have to attract external funding constantly, while in the meantime, keeping the teaching staff expenses at a minimum. So this is what's happening. And how do you do this? How do you keep the teaching expenses at a minimum while you are getting external funding all the time? Like, how do you maintain that sort of mechanism? Well, you eliminate institutes and degree programs that do not attract private funding or that do not fetch immediate market value. You hire people who can prove in their CVs that they either have ties to the corporate world or who have a track record of successful third-party funding acquisition. And you hire the majority of your staff in project-based temporary positions instead of tenure, because these project-based temporary positions pay themselves. The university does not pay from its own public funding. So as a result, the universities end up decreasing tenure and increasing contingent labor in universities. And contingent faculty, we hear that a lot. It refers basically to part-time staff or full-time staff off the tenure line. And it includes adjunct lecturers and postdoc researchers working either in their own externally funded projects or in the projects of tenured professors as their assistants. And these people are the new faculty majority. By the way, don't mind me saying these people and externalizing the problem. I belong to them as well. We are the new faculty majority due to the financial cutbacks and the rise of short-term project-based employment practices. And when I say we are the majority, I really mean it. I mean, in the US, currently, the adjunct faculty constitutes 75% of the entire workforce, or entire academic workforce. In Denmark, they're around 50%. In the UK, 68 to 70%. And in Germany, hold up, because we have a record high, 92% of the entire academic workforce works on fixed-term contracts, which means only 8% has tenure, which means only 8% has job security. And these are the full professors. And everything below full professorship is fixed term, regardless of your qualifications, regardless of how many brilliant books and articles you have published, regardless of your seniority in the business, you're still an early career, assistant, so to speak, in other people's projects. Now, as I said, by now, the temporarily employed researchers, the temporarily employed staff has reached such a majority that it has come to be referred to as a distinct layer or a political actor in the making, if you will. And we call it the academic precariat. And of course, there are some contextual differences, but all in all, what characterizes the academic precariat is, first of all, a very fragile relation to formal employment. We are always hanging by a thread. A forced nomadic mode of living, what the German sociologist and comrade Peter Ulrich calls the precarious mobility, meaning a forced mobility between institutions, places, and positions every few years. It involves lack of stable future prospects, because you never know what's going to come next after your current research project or research period that is funded for, I don't know, 6 months or 2 years at the most. And last but not least, the academic precariat is marked by disposability. Now, disposability means there's simply too many people that have the same qualifications as you do, or at least similar qualifications, as a result of which your years of education, all your efforts, all your carefully acquired merits, etc., don't mean anything in the labor market, or at least they don't mean as much as you would think when you and your parents were paying loads of money to fancy grad schools. So as such, today's academic precariat, I would say, corresponds to what Marx had described as the reserve army of labor. You know, all these masses, thousands of highly qualified, smart people who have PhDs and who have years of teaching and research experience, yet who are crawling to find a temporary job for 6 months or 2 to 3 years at the most, with low pay and low to zero social benefits. That's what we're looking at. And imagine 92% of the academic workforce in Germany consists of people like these, highly qualified and highly devaluated. And of course, this situation has immense implications at a lot of levels, I would say. First of all, these masses of people reportedly suffer from many hideous things, starting with unpaid overwork, self-exploitation, exclusion from social benefits, lack of infrastructural and institutional support, exclusion from institutional decision-making mechanisms, because all these faculty boards and committees, etc., they only consist of tenured professors, although the non-tenured people constitute the majority. So much to institutional democracy at the bastion of scientific freedoms. And last but not least, in many cases, the academic precariat also is more vulnerable to mobbing and sexual harassment and all sorts of workplace misconduct, because most of the time, first of all, you do not have the institutional backing. And the people that you're dealing with are influential tenured professors most of the time. So you rather keep your mouth shut and don't mess up your chances of getting a stable position. So you can imagine what that means for academic ethics and workplace conduct. So you see here a little table where I summarized the negative implications of contingent labor under 3 categories. First of all, it has negative implications for the future of higher education and research in general, because people who are hired for a short term and who most of the time have to juggle between many different lectureships, even during one semester, they don't have time to provide proper mentorship for their students, or they don't have time or energy to improve the content or the style of their teaching. They can't afford to do so because they're barely surviving. So the relationship with the students and the quality of teaching naturally suffer from the short-termism that is imposed upon the adjunct faculty. On the other hand, we are looking at a group of people who are suffering from various physical and mental complications as well, due to their extremely vulnerable and insecure position. It's not easy to deal with the fact that you work and work and work and still don't have a future, and you can barely pay your rent. So if you look at the impact of contingent labor practices on the occupational development and personal well-being of researchers, we have a very tragic picture. Most of the precarious researchers are under extreme pressure and workload, and this works negatively on their mental and physical health. There are several reports, especially reporting from the so-called leading scientific countries, about how mental health is in decline in academia and how many non-tenured lecturers or researchers are suffering from massive burnout and depression and anxiety. Because not only you have to work like crazy, but you also have to live with the fact that no matter how much you work, you still don't even have the basic securities, and you still don't have any clear career prospects. It's not sustainable to live with that mindset over a long period of time. You go crazy. And when I say crazy, I mean literally crazy. Look at me. Do I look normal to you? So, of course, all of these things, like the personal individual implications and the implications of contingent employment for the future of higher education, etc., it also works negatively on the peer relations, because you are looking at a highly hierarchical system where people in the same profession actually have different interests that are clashing most of the time. And also, the rapid turnover and the constant mobility prevents especially the non-tenured faculty from developing lasting relationships and developing solidarity with their peers. And at a political level, if you think about it, the non-tenured faculty are afraid of being labeled as too political and too radical. And this may be one of the reasons why they are not revolting against these working conditions as well. So it has political implications as well. It has implications in terms of scientific freedoms and freedom of expression within the academic institutions. And this is to be taken very seriously. So the question you're probably asking yourselves, at least I'm asking myself this question constantly, how did it get so bad? Like, how was it possible to turn the universities into sweatshops within a relatively short period of time? Like, all these smart people who love to preach about resistance and who love to preach about workers' rights in other sectors and revolution and justice and blah, blah, like, were they all asleep when their workers' rights were being curtailed at the universities? Like, how did this happen? I would say, and it really breaks my heart to say this, I would say it was the traditional work culture in academia itself that made it possible for us to accept that degree of abuse. Academia as a sector is marked by a highly ceremonial culture. And this ceremonial culture, as you can see here on the slide, it includes artifacts like caps and gowns and chairs, in its double meaning, of course, syllabi, theses, diplomas, degrees, articles, books, and most recently with the digital turn, especially during the pandemic times, it also contains, video lectures and Zoom lectures and online courses, digital platforms, etc. So they joined the repertoire of academic artifacts as well. In addition to these artifacts, we also have distinct rituals such as lectures, seminars, disputations, professorial appointments, etc. All these ceremonies where we use the nice fancy caps and gowns. And there's, of course, a certain work culture, a professional ethos that maintains and underlies these ceremonial artifacts and rituals. I don't know if you had the time to, I mean, I'm addressing the students right now because my colleagues are already familiar with this. You might have noticed that the academic sector, the academic profession has an image of autonomy and creativity. But in actual fact, the academic work culture is substantially rigid and disciplinary and authoritarian. Let me tell you what I mean by that. I mean, first of all, there's this idea that those who choose the academic path should be disciplined, intrinsically motivated, dedicated, passionate, etc. Like this is a prerequisite. You know, it's not enough that you want to choose the academic career, that you are interested in some things. No, you want it badly. Like it's not enough for you to be interested. You have to be burning for it. Like, you know, you want to really want it badly. And you have to showcase how badly and madly in love you are with your research. You know, you have to gush over your students and your research projects like an Instagram influencer gushes over a new cosmetic product. You know, like you have to promote it all the time. And the academic industry, as you see, prescribes how you should feel about your profession. It sets it as a prerequisite. Otherwise, you're not academic enough. You know, it sets a certain emotional standard. I mean, it wouldn't be enough for me to teach and write 2 articles per year without gushing over it. I have to bore people to death by talking about my research constantly. This should be the center of my life. You know, I shouldn't be meeting with my colleagues and talk about normal stuff. We should be talking about our research projects all the time. Otherwise, we wouldn't take each other seriously. Now, if you think about it, and a couple of scholars have said it before me, of course, it can even be argued that the academic sector was a source of inspiration with its obsession for the neoliberal work culture. You know, in neoliberalism, the workers are not only expected to show up at work or do what they're being told, but they have to take initiative. They have to be passionate. They have to be engaged. You know, neoliberal enterprises, as a rule, aim at controlling the workers' libidinal energies. And all these things, like this passion and dedication and self-initiative, etc., all these things that are new in white-collar sectors, they were actually the norm in the academic sector, at least for the last 150 years. So they learned it from us, believe me. And for this reason, it is very common to see academics, especially early career ones, boasting about how passionate they are about their research, how much they work to the point of collapse, you know, like bragging about self-destructive working habits and total burnout. Because those who do not conform to these ritualistic tenets and those who do not brag about how much they destroy themselves by working, they face various forms of exclusion. First of all, the moment you act like a normal person and treat your career like a job, people start questioning your dedication. And God forbid you criticize the working conditions, because then people really get hostile and they start asking things like, then why are you in the profession? Why are you in academia? As if loving what you do has to necessarily mean that you have to accept abuse. I mean, how toxic is that? So most of the time, the majority of the academics and novices are tamed into compliance by this extremely punitive and intimidating ethos. This ethos that preaches and vehemently demands self-sacrifice, self-neglect, dedication to the point of collapse, and, you know, denial of material and physical and psychological needs, short everything that a good therapist would tell you that it's self-destructive and borderline masochistic. So this is the work culture that we're looking at. But it's not completely devoid of function. I mean, it fulfills some functions, not for us, not for the non-tenured majority, but for the establishment itself. First of all, the artifacts and the rituals, they function as bogus status symbols. I say bogus because the values that they're supposed to symbolize are long undermined. All those caps and gowns and those hideous academic jargons, like they're actually just instruments of status distinction. They serve to create the illusion that academics are not wage laborers, that we do something different. And the self-sacrificial ethos, on the other hand, now this is not as innocent as the caps and gowns. It explicitly serves to perpetuate unpaid labor and self-exploitation. And it has a historical background, of course. We did not invent it just now. Historically, and it was justified for a while, by the way. I mean, historically, it was institutionalized through the state-run formation of the modern research university in the Germanic countries. It was consolidated through these academic rites and ceremonies, but it had a background due to the close cooperation of the universities with the states. In the past, the tenured professor at a state university who held a civil servant status, this person used to be the quintessential type of academic worker. So there was some sort of truth to the public service emphasis to that. And as such, the position connoted a certain selflessness that pertained to public service. And it also involved a direct link to the state apparatus as well, which was problematic, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But right now, in our times, the emphasis on public service is simply a lie, because the majority of the academic workers do not even have a civil servant status. So logically, today's academic workers, today's faculty majority, should be thinking, I'm not even offered basic job security. I don't even have a clear future in the career. All I have is gigs, in form of short-term scholarships and adjunct lectureships. So why should I dedicate my life to this? Why should I do more than the necessary minimum? Why should I invest so much? Here comes the rhetoric of passion into play. The rhetoric of passion that is so pervasive and so dominant, this prevents us from thinking logically and clearly. And it makes us still hold on to the illusion that what we do is beyond wage labor. This is what we still believe in. So on the whole, thinking about the function of this ceremonial culture, an integral part of this illusion about the exceptionality of academic work has been actually sustained by, first of all, the civil servant status that used to be the case for the vast bulk of academic workers until recently. The accompanying myth about the sanctity of public service, which was tied to that civil servant status, and the idealization of immaterial labor, the idea that some activities are done for the public good and they're more valuable because they contain a thinking process and they are more selfless and beyond and above the banality of wage labor. The academics, we don't say it out loud, but what we think is like other people work for money. We work for the sublime quest for truth. So this is the thing. And it's actually, if you think about it, it's Platonic and extremely conservative. Thinking that immaterial labor is more important and more sacred than other forms of labor. It is inherently reactionary, if you think about it. But we usually don't. We just accept it the way it is. Now, I do think about it sometimes, and I think that it's nonsense. And it's nonsense for basically two reasons. First of all, if you think about it, all work is some sort of public service in the sense that it serves collective needs, because we live in a world of codependency. I mean, we all depend on other people's labor in order to satisfy our various needs. So if you think about it, all work is essential for our survival. And second, academic work is everything but selfless. I mean, if it were selfless and altruistic, then there wouldn't be patents and copyrights, and we wouldn't be paying hundreds of dollars to scientific journals for access to their stupid articles, which we wrote ourselves, by the way. So all produced knowledge would be open access, but this is not the case. It's a zillion-dollar industry. And last but not least, in today's academia, the civil servant status, as I said before, is rather the exception. I mean, the majority of the academic workforce consists of temporarily employed and externally funded researchers and instructors. So what's going on here? Like, we are expected to work like civil servants, but live like disposable, low-skilled wage laborers. So this is what's going on. And graduate students are blindsided by the ceremonial conformity with all its shiny traditional aura, the fancy rituals and the sacred aura around academic work lure thousands of young people every year into doing PhDs, although we know that most of them statistically cannot be absorbed by the academic industry. And then the self-sacrificial ethos suppresses criticism and guarantees obedience, and makes early career researchers waste decades of their lives in dead-end postdoc and adjunct lectureships. And by the time you realize that a tenured professorship is an unattainable holy grail, and you will probably statistically never obtain it, it's already too late to quit and start a new career, because you're in your mid-40s and it's like you wasted your entire life in this. And as in all organizational structures, the institutionalized myths and rituals, they serve to protect the establishment from having its conduct questioned. These rituals and this self-sacrificial ethos, they protect the privileged few by creating an intimidating aura around the university. But in reality, there is absolutely nothing sacred or epic or mystical about today's academic work. I'm sorry to crash your dreams if I do. It's a billion-dollar industry full of petty power struggles, full of petty people, disguised behind fancy terminologies and archaic ceremonies. That's all. But luckily, this is not the end of the story, because some people are aware of this, or let's say more and more people are becoming aware of this. So some people finally started to see the truth, and there have been some cases of resistance in recent times. Precarious researchers in several countries developed solidarity networks, grassroots movements, advocacy groups, unionized struggles. Some tried to build local unions, etc. For example, in the US, there has been a variety of reactions ranging from advocacy groups to grassroots solidarity movements to unionized struggles and unionization attempts, etc. In other countries where you have strong unions, for example, in the UK and France, we have seen organized resistance in form of mass strikes, which have been very successful in the last 2 years. In other countries where you don't have high unionization rates in the academic sector, like Germany or Switzerland or Denmark, you rather see grassroots networks and solidarity platforms, which evolve into nationwide platforms in time. And they look promising, at least in terms of bringing about a discursive shift. In Spain and Italy, we have seen some mass mobilizations in the past decade against austerity measures and Bologna-induced neoliberal reforms, and so on and so forth. So there is still some hope, so something is flourishing. But of course, it takes time, and you may want to discuss how much leverage, especially the grassroots initiatives have, considering the fact that they do not have like the legal standing of a union and the protection mechanisms of a union. But still, it's worth believing in the optimism of the will, so to speak. So that was what I wanted to say in a nutshell. I hope I didn't bore you to death. I think we can clear the floor to discussions and questions. I just, wrote some main lines along which we can discuss the issue, especially in view of the role of passion in intellectual sectors in general, which affects us all. And there is this question that actually has been occupying my mind for some time now, like, is doing what you love a luxury that you have to pay for with unpaid overwork and with other sorts of abuse? And how does the relationship between the knowledge workers' physical, mental health affect the future of higher education, etc.?